Hi there and welcome to this video. I thought I'd do something different this week. Quite often in the winter here in the UK it's quite difficult to get out and shoot, as I've said in previous videos, and therefore to keep the momentum going you have to find opportunities to shoot in a different way. One of the things I tend to do in the winter is I shift the balance of time I spend outside trying to capture images to going back through perhaps the longer months in the summer, looking at the images I've captured and seeing what I can do with them in post-production. So I flick the balance towards post-production. So I thought this week I would just spend a few minutes and look at a couple of the images that I've particularly pulled out from a trip to Bologna earlier in the year. You'll have seen from my previous video we went to Bologna. We also went to the Ferrari Museum at Maranello and down in Modena. And at the Ferrari Museum in Modena, rather in Maranello actually, where the factory is, they have this amazing collection of Ferraris, and they're all set in a beautiful museum, and the lighting is quite difficult for photography because obviously it's quite harsh, it's quite spotlit, so it can be quite good but it can be quite tricky. There's also quite a lot of people there. Also, you're quite a little bit restricted in how close you can get to the car and the angles you can get and what's in the way and so on. So I've got a couple of images that I wanted to see whether I could create a bit of a starting embryonic collection of photos from that trip. So let's take a look at them in Lightroom and see what we can achieve with them in Lightroom alone. I'm not going to use Photoshop, I'm going to keep it pretty simple and see what I can achieve in just a few minutes of editing as a first cut. So let's take a look at the images. So here are the images in Lightroom, and the thumbnails, I've got them in a catalogue, so let's make the thumbnails slightly larger and use the slider at the bottom. As you can see, a couple of really nice Ferraris here, one really an old racing car and another one an old road car. I'm going to start with the racing car. Both have got fairly high contrast lighting, and the background is quite dark, which is what I like. They're quite similar in that respect. So let's start with this old racing car, number 22, and I always start by creating a virtual copy, which I use because then I've always got the original to go back to. As you'll see, it was taken with my Z7 with the 2470 f2.8 lens attached. It was at ISO 100. I tend to have the camera set to ISO 100 most of the time. It was at 25mm, so it was at the fairly wide end of the lens. I took it in portrait mode. So it was 1/15 of a second at f2.8, so a fairly shallow depth of field, hence the angle I was taking it at. I managed to get most of the car in focus, and at 1/15 it was reasonably sharp. You can see the scratches, the swirls in the paintwork. So, you know, the Z7 was doing quite well in what was a relatively low light scene where I was constraining it by the ISO I chose to use to avoid too much noise. I quite like this because the car does stand out from a pretty interesting black background. So if we start by hitting develop, now we can always, as I say, quite often I'll start by hitting auto over here. Now for me that doesn't create the image that I want because I can see it's actually lifted the shadows in the background too much, so that's not quite the image I'm looking for. It's not a bad image, but if I click on tone it takes it back to the original settings. These settings here are what comes out of the Z7. That it comes and imports some of the settings that the camera uses into into Lightroom already. So let's just see what we can do here. Now the style I'm looking for is to keep that black background nice and black and then lift the car up. So actually I'm going to start by really zooming in on the car. I'll start by checking my composition. I think I got it pretty good in camera. It's reasonably symmetric down the middle. The center line comes down through the center of the car. The 22 is on the thirds, so I quite like that. So I'm not going to mess around with the the crop on this one. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start by using a radial filter, and let's pull it down over. I'm looking to do the center of the car. Now what you can always do is hit O, and you can see the bit that will be affected by the filter. Now I want to invert it because I want to adjust the car so it stands out. So that works quite well. Now I don't want to affect the dark, the shadows and the black around it. So what I'm going to use is a luminance mask here. And again, you can hit show luminance mask, and what it will do, you can see the red area in the middle here is the areas that will be affected by the changes I make. Now I don't want the black, so what you can do is you can pull up this shader here to reduce the luminance levels that the adjustments you make affect. So if I brought it down, it would change it so the white, the very light areas wouldn't be affected. I actually want those to be affected, so let's leave that, take that off again. And what I can do is I can bring up the exposure, because it brings, of the areas that I've selected that I've masked, it will bring those up and lift them. I'll take the contrast up a little. I'll bring the highlights down, because one of the things I'm going to want to deal with is this very bright area in the middle here and this reflection. Now I also want to lift it out, so I'm going to use texture, which will really bring a bit of sharpening, a bit of vibrance to some of those colours. If we want to look at the effect, we can click on this little switch down here for turning the radial filter off and then turn it back on, so you can see it's starting to lift those colours in the middle. I may also want a little bit more saturation coming out, because I really want that red to pop, because that is the highlight of this. I'll bring the shadows up to just lift some of those areas out. I'm making fairly minimal changes here. Take the blacks down a little bit just to give it a little more contrast. It's really just lifted some of those areas, some of those highlights, made it pop a little bit more. So I'm happy with that as a starting point. Now I also want to try and lift these two areas here with the tyres and the wheels a little bit. So I'm going to do a similar approach again. I'll invert the radial filter. I just want to try and lift out the detail in this wheel mechanism here, and a little bit of that highlight on the tyre there, just so as you get a hint that it's there. Now one thing you'll notice here is that in Lightroom, if you turn off radial filters, it doesn't just turn off the one you're working on, it turns off all of them. Lightroom doesn't work with layers. Photoshop works with layers, so you can turn on and off individual layers. Lightroom doesn't. It's a non-destructive program, but it works with a single layer in effect that all of your effects sit on. So all of the radial filters work on the same plane in effect. So I could create a new radial filter. What I'm going to do in this case, I'm going to duplicate it, so I start from a similar point. That to me is lifting this a little bit too much, so I'm going to come back over just so you get a glint of that wheel, that tyre tread, so you know the tyre's there, but actually it doesn't detract from the main event, which is the car in the middle. The other thing I want to just lift out is just this side here, this exhaust. Let's try using a brush to do that, and again, if we hit O, you'll see the areas that I've just brushed there. I've caught just a little bit too much around here. I don't want those to be affected, so I can just take that back out using the erase. That's okay. So there, what we can do is, I think here what I want is just the highlights on the exhaust to be lifted out very slightly. So I think that just lifts it. There's one area here that I did want to look at, which is this this highlight in the middle here. So that, again, let's use a radial filter because it has Got a bit of feathering around it. I'm going to have to invert it again. So if I hit O, you can see where it's affecting. And on this occasion, I want to bring down the exposure a little bit. I want to bring down the highlights a little bit, but I don't want it to take away the whiteness. If you take away too much, you can start to see it. And sometimes when you make these kind of adjustments, you have to just bring the saturation up a little bit again to bring it back in. As you can see, it's really started to lift some of these. Now what I am going to do is, you can use, what I want to do is create a bit of a vignette around the car to draw your eye into the car. And if we go into effects down the bottom here, we can add in a little bit of a vignette there, which does work quite well. Now what I prefer to do, because it gives you more control, is use a radial filter to create a vignette. So if we if we create a radial filter that sits just inside here, and you can control the area you want it to affect. If we look at where it is, it needs to perhaps go out a bit, and also the feathering just come down a bit as well, so it doesn't affect the car. And then what we can do is we can either drop the exposure a little bit, increase the contrast, perhaps even just drop the shadows a little bit. Now for me that's coming in just a bit too close, so we'll have to bring that out. So you can see that just with a few minor tweaks, we've turned this into a better image, I think. Now, if we go back to our grids, there's the original, there's the new version. I'm going to create another version. I'm going to just give this 2 stars, so I know it's one that I've worked on. Give that one 2 stars, and if we go into this one, which will carry over all of the amendments I've made. So what I'm going to do is I want to see whether a more vintage or faded look would work with this image. So I'm just going to play around with the curves here to create a more faded image. So if I take the blacks out and make them slightly grey, and then just drop this back and make a bit of an S curve with these. As you raise it, the black is no longer a black, it makes it a slightly more grey. So what this means is that for pixels that have a black luminance, you want them to be grey. So what this is saying is if this was a straight line across, black will be black, and at this end white will be white, and the luminances will be the exact, will be correct. Now what we've done here by moving this up is said any pixel that has a very low luminance, a black, is now no longer black. We want it to be a dark grey, and then we want to bring it back to a more normal colour in the midtones, and then we want to lift the highlights and bring those up and make them slightly over exaggerated. So what you can see here is it's got a slightly faded look. I'm not sure this is quite right for, I may have to work on this a little bit more. So let's look at the next image that we've got. Now this is front on. It's got quite a lot of distraction in the background, but obviously with an f2.8 lens, let's just look at the settings here. So again, it was my 2470 f2.8 with a Z7. This unfocal length was around 40mm. Again, ISO 100, 1/20th of a second at f2.8. So this time I knew I was taking the image straight on. I wanted to blur out the background, so very shallow depth of field, just get that 417 number really in focus there. So let's just take a quick look at what we've managed to achieve here. So that's our edited photo, and that's the one before. So as you can see, it's really lifted the car without too much effort. That's probably 5 minutes, 10 minutes in Lightroom. If I wasn't actually talking to the camera and talking to you guys, I'd probably have done it quicker. It's not a perfect image, but it's a good starting point, and it shows you what can be achieved in Lightroom. Now what I'm also going to do before I finish here, I'm going to do a similar faded look to the previous image. So I hope you found this video useful. What I want to show you was that with a couple of images and probably 20 minutes, you can really lift your images in post-production using Lightroom. It's a fairly simple program to use. As I say, I find it's where art meets the science of photography, and therefore it's not about knowing exactly what every slider does. It's useful to know what they do, but the combinations of them, really just play with them, just experiment with them, see what happens. Hopefully what I've showed you today is the power of the radial tool mostly, because that's what I've been using mostly today. And it allows you to localize the tweaks to the image, to lift different parts. As I say, I rarely really go into looking at an image and knowing exactly what I'm going to do with it in Lightroom. A lot of it evolves as I go through it. Sometimes, like today, I'll do 2 or 3 versions of an image and see which ones I prefer. I hope you found it useful. If you did, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell below, and let me know how you're getting on with Lightroom, or do you use a different program? Are you using something like Affinity? How are you getting on with them? Are you spending more time in the winter months doing post-production rather than capturing images? If so, what's your challenges? What have you found that you think would be useful to the community? So I'll leave you with the 4 images I've created today. Let me know which ones you prefer in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you on a future video.